The humble knot. Knots are everywhere in our world. Whether it's tying your shoes in the morning, or the surgical sutures that surgeons use to tie up wounds, or the knots that your grandpa shows you when you go fishing with him, knots have an important role in our lives every day. However, in 2019, it's easy to forget that knots even exist because some people, in fact, most people, don't know a lot of knots or use them really in their everyday life for different purposes. I learned about knots during my time in Boy Scouts, where we had to memorize a whole lot of them. But since then, I still remember many of the knots that I learned without practicing them on a day to day basis, because they were so useful in such a wide variety of situations that I found ways to apply them in my everyday life. In this speech, I hope to give you some context to the rich history of knots and how they've come to become so important today in our world. Also, I hope to show you some of the knots that I learned in Boy Scouts and found so useful then and now. In order to give some context on why knots are so important today, we have to examine their development over time throughout human history, which is a truly extensive story. In fact, the first knots are probably so old that they're entirely lost to time. According to Judy Rosen, a journalist who wrote in 2014 for the New York Times Magazine, the first knots are probably entirely lost to time because they decomposed over time and wouldn't have the same staying power as something like a tooth, bone, or rock in our archaeological record. But we do know that knots predate both the axe and the wheel in the genealogy of human tool use. In fact, she suggests that some experts believe that gorillas were the first to use knots, not humans, and tied sort of proto-granny knots to create their shelters out of plant material. But we do know that knots were extremely important in early human life. According to a 2019 expose on knot expert Henry Bushby by the Mariners Museum and Library Gallery, the first knots were likely tied out of plant fibers, strips of animal skin, or even human hair. In fact, it notes that the Mayans in early times probably used knots to help develop their mathematical system by counting the knots on a rope. As ancient times gave way to more recent, we saw the golden age of knots during humans' exploration of the world's oceans. According once again to the Mariners Museum and Library Gallery, sea time expedition calls for a lot of knots. Whether you're tying up the sail on a giant ship, anchoring that ship into harbor, or even tying together the hammocks that early ocean explorers slept in, knots and ropes were plentiful on the high seas. In fact, the first ever English language manual for seamen, which was written in 1627, included 3 knots: the sheepshank, the walnut, and the bowline knot. These 3 knots formed the basis of a plethora of different knots, which would be invented, refined, and perfected by seamen, and then introduced to the rest of the world, increasing our knowledge and our usage of knots. As the age of exploration has given way to modern times, knots remain incredibly important in everyday life. According to Judy Rosen's aforementioned piece for the New York Times, in 1944, the Bible for knot experts was written, the Ashley Book of Knots, which includes descriptions for the usage and creation of many, many different knots. As time has gone on, the countless knots listed in this book have shown up everywhere, from the electrical harnesses that anchor satellites in space to the knots on your sweatpants waistband before you go to bed. Knots are clearly incredibly important, and a history that started thousands of years ago has led us to a present day full of knots. Now that we appreciate just how important knots are, we can learn a few knots of our own. And I've selected 4 knots that I learned in Boy Scouts that are simple, have different uses, and illustrate how knots are such a powerful tool. The first one is the square knot. The square knot is used to tie 2 groups together, and it's easy to tie and to untie. According to the U.S. Army Manual on Rigging Techniques, Procedures, and Applications by Mark Herkomer, the square knot is weakest when the ropes are wet or you're tying together 2 differently sized ropes, neither of which will be the case with our knot today. In this knot, we're going to tie together both ends of this rope to create a sturdy loop. All of the explanations for how to tie these knots were found in a 2016 article for Scouting Magazine by Cliff Jacobson entitled How to Tie 10 Essential Scouting Knots. The way we tie the square knot is by taking 1 strand in each hand. The strand in our right hand passes over the strand in our left hand and back under like so. The strand in our left hand goes over the right and back through, like so, to create a square knot. In order to test if you tied this correctly, you can loosen it, like so, and the knot should easily give way with the two loops interacting with each other like so. This knot is very easy to tie, and it's generally effective. But the purpose of knowing many knots isn't just to know one and use it in every situation, but to know multiple and use them in a variety of situations for a variety of different purposes. Our second knot today is supposed to illustrate this concept, the sheet bend. The sheet bend is a kind of knot that joins together two different types of rope. And according once again to the U.S. Army Manual on Rigging Techniques, Procedures, and Applications, it joins two ropes like a square knot, but better for a variety of reasons. First off, the sheet bend is stronger. It also performs better with differently sized or with wet ropes. Again, according to Cliff Jacobson's article in Scouting Magazine on how to tie knots, we tie the sheet bend like so. Forming a loop with one rope, we take our other one and pass it through the loop from behind. And then in front and back behind the loop, coming back through. Then it's reinserted like so, and the sheet bend is pulled tight. As we can see, this is a tight knot that secures two ropes together very effectively and with a lot of strength. It's useful for a lot of different purposes, whether you're lengthening a rope or simply going camping and want two ropes to be tied together to anchor your tent. In fact, the sheet bend is so useful that according to the Mariners Museum Library and Gallery exposition on Henry Bushby that I mentioned before, ancient Incas used the sheet bend to create nets that they would use during hunting. The sheet bend and the square knot have a similar purpose, and this third knot, the Bolen knot, is intended to exhibit how knots really become useful when using them for different purposes. The Bolen knot is intended to create a sturdy loop at the end of a string. According to the U.S. Army Field Manual on Rigging Techniques, Procedures, and Applications, which has been mentioned twice before, it's a strong loop that doesn't tighten, which is an important feature in a loop because if you're hanging something heavy from it, you don't want your knot to become so tight that it's impossible to untie. Once again, according to Cliff Jacobson's article, we tie the Bolen like so. Like we're tying half a square knot, go right over left, but then take the free end, the shorter end, and pass it behind the taller strand, back through, and down through itself. It can be tightened like so. As you can see, the Bolen knot is a strong knot, but it doesn't tighten or slip under pressure, the key feature of this knot. It's useful in a variety of situations and extremely strong. In fact, so strong that the rope will often break before the Bolen knot itself slips. The final knot that I want to demonstrate today is the taut-line hitch, an extremely useful kind of hitch. According to arborist Mark Adams in a 2005 column for the publication Arborist News, there are many names for this knot, but it's been extremely important for arborists and tree climbers in the United States and is the favorite and preferred knot of this group. And this is for good reason. According, once again, to the U.S. Army Field Guide on Rigging Techniques, Procedures, and Applications, the taut-line hitch is a kind of hitch, a knot to join your rope to an anchor, such as a pipe or a branch. It's an extremely strong knot, but its real advantage is in its adjustability. According to Cliff Jacobson's article in Scouting Magazine, we tie the taut-line hitch like so. First, thread your rope around the anchor. Then, take the shorter end and pass it in front of and then behind the longer end to create a half hitch. Let's get a little extra rope here because we'll need it, and then go back in front and behind to create a second half hitch. The real strength of the taut-line hitch, however, comes with our third like so. Now, as we can see, the taut-line hitch is an extremely sturdy knot. But what's especially nice about this is when you slacken the rope, you can actually adjust this knot up and down the string to change the size of the loop. This is especially useful if you want your rope to have variable length and you want a strong anchor that won't tighten so much that you'll be impossible to untie later. So I hope that these 4 knots demonstrated my general purpose, but they're just the tip of the iceberg. There are books with descriptions of how to make and use literally thousands of different knots. People spend entire academic careers on knot tying and just studying the different ways that you can use them in everyday life. So I hope that these knots have been enough to convince you that they're worthwhile as both a tool and an effective way to solve different problems. In this speech today, we looked across the vast history of knots. From early humans to their golden age during ocean exploration to modern day, knots are exceptionally important. We also learned 4 knots: the square knot, sheet bend, bowline knot, and taut line hitch, all of which serve different purposes and were intended to show how knots can be effective in a variety of different situations. So hopefully the next time you're tying a knot, you don't haphazardly loop some stuff together and pray that it holds, but rather consider knots as an effective tool that can be used correctly in order to create a variety of different ropes that will serve a variety of different purposes and ultimately help you better solve the job.